Good evening, everyone. It is once again Ted the Speed Learner, and tonight I'm going to cover the topic of the metal oxide silicon field effect transistor. And if you don't know what that is, I want you to watch this video all the way through. But before I start this conversation up, I'm probably one of the rare few YouTube personalities on the YouTube platform that will never go, "Oh, please, 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 please like my video. And if you would be ever so kind as to subscribe to my channel, which will cause all my videos to be shared all over the platform." Let me tell you something. That ain't going to work. And I'll tell you why. Because YouTube cannot determine what they need to determine, which is whether my videos are keeping you guys on their platform by the use of the like buttons and the subscribe buttons, okay? Now, why do these people tell you this? Well, number one, it extends the watch time on their videos, which I'll tell you a little later why that would have an effect. But anyway, the other thing is that the like button itself, you could flip through things all day long, just go like. It's not going to tell YouTube anything, okay? Now, as for the subscribe button, that's a little different story. Have you noticed that when you hit the subscribe button now, this little menu pops up and it sets your bell notifications? There you go. That's why they're telling you that. Now, the bell notifications might tell YouTube something about how popular your channel is, and they might want to share your videos because of it, okay? But what will cause YouTube to share your videos? Well, there are two things you can... Well, first of all, if people like you who are watching these videos right now were to copy the URL of the video and share it on a different social media platform like Facebook, what used to be Twitter, now is X, Gab, you got Truth Social, Instagram, Threads, whatever you want to share it on, that would get your video shared more, okay? Number two, when you increase the watch time of the video, then YouTube gets an indication that people are actually watching the whole thing and not just watching bits or pieces and jump cutting through everything in your video. So that is a good indication. The other thing you could do, okay, is you can leave very nice comments in the comments section below. And what that tells them is you were engaged, you watched, you replied, you really liked the content that you were watching, and that helps your ratings as well. So really what you really want to do if you want to increase, if you want to motivate YouTube to share your videos more often, watch the videos all the way through. Well, not you, but I mean your audience needs to watch the videos all the way through, increasing the watch time of every single one of your videos, or have them leave the nice comments in the comment section below so that YouTube can see for themselves that, gee, this is a video we want to share all over the platform. And there you go. And another thing I need to mention real quick before we resume our video is that I have published 5 Kindle books. They're $5 a piece. If you want a copy of any of these Kindle books, just leave me a comment in the comment section below and I'll send you a hyperlink to my latest book, which you now can see on the screen. And then from there you can find my other 4 Kindle books, and there will be more Kindle books coming soon. It's all up to you. Buy them and let me know what you think about them. Alright, on to the video. Alright, I'm going to start with an illustration here. Now, this is kind of going back to my unipolar transistor video that I told you there was a link to another video that you could watch that would explain the unipolar transistor a little bit better than I could. They had an illustration in there, and I'm going to give you this one. It looks like a TV with rabbit ears, but really it's not. This here would be germanium, and right above the germanium is this positive charge carrier layer, okay? And this gold foil would come in contact with this. and then they'd hook a battery to all this. Okay, actually they're going to hook 2 batteries to all this. Alright, and I'm going to have an illustration on this video that if you're watching me on the live stream, you're not seeing it right now, but you will see it when I actually make the video here. But anyway, let's get into this. What is a metal oxide silicon field effect transistor? Okay? Now, in previous videos, I discussed the topics of watt, amp, and volt. And I would suggest that before you watch this one all the way through, if you are not familiar with the terms watt, amp, and volt, I would head over to those videos and watch them. Okay? Now, in that particular set of videos, okay, I stated that electrical current flows in one direction while electrons flow in the opposite direction. Remember that? So let's say that you have a battery and there are electrons flowing from the cathode of the battery to the anode. Okay? If that is occurring, then electrical current is flowing from the anode of the battery to the cathode. But what does this have to do with MOSFET? Well, in my previous video where I discussed the unipolar transistor, I said that this transistor was also called the field effect transistor. I wonder what that has to do with the title of this video. Well, the letters FET stand for field effect transistor. Okay, so that's what we're going to discuss. And as I said in that video, the very first unipolar transistor had a piece of germanium. That's this one. And then there was this little piece of copper right here. Okay? That's because copper is an excellent conductor of electricity. That's what it is. Now, connected to the top of the germanium was a couple pieces of gold foil. Okay, so what you've got is you got your copper here, your germanium here, and these gold foils. Okay? And gold is an excellent conductor of electricity. Now, here we have this positively charged carrier layer. That means that there are protons in this layer right here. Okay? If this layer has protons in it, what do you think this germanium had in it? Well, it has electrons. It has more electrons than protons. This layer had more protons than electrons. Okay. At this point, I'm going to show you an illustration. You can now see it on the screen. There was a battery connected to the carrier layer, which I'm presuming is the copper, and also connected to the germanium. The positive part of the battery was connected to the carrier layer. The negative part of the battery was connected to the germanium. When the battery was connected to the germanium and the carrier layer, protons in the carrier layer became attracted to the electrons in the germanium. And as we now know, current flowed from the positive terminal of the battery to the carrier layer. And the current flowed from the germanium to the negative terminal of the battery. Why did this happen? When the protons in the carrier layer of the unipolar transistor started flowing towards the electrons of the germanium, molecule holes began to develop in the carrier layer. As far as I understand it, I don't have a perfect understanding of this, protons from the battery flowed into the carrier layer of the transistor to replace the protons that were attracted to the germanium. And if I got any of this information incorrect, please leave me a comment in the comments section below. Alright, again, if I understand this information correctly, the electrons from the germanium were attracted to the protons in the carrier layer. That means the germanium was losing electrons. And if that being the case, then electrons from the battery quickly replaced the electrons in the germanium. Now, if you guys want to elaborate on this, fine. If you'll recall from my unipolar transistor video, I stated that 2 strips of gold foil were connected to germanium through this carrier layer. And I'm not forgetting about the carrier layer that was placed between the gold foil strips and the germanium. At this point, we have to establish that the first piece of gold foil was connected to the battery. But what about the second gold foil piece? Okay, so we have a battery connected to this side of the equation here. Okay. But what about the right? Yeah, this is the left-hand side. Okay, this is the left-hand side of this. The battery was connected on this left-hand side. But what about the right-hand side? Well, we had another battery connected to the right-hand side. Okay, so you now have 2 batteries connected to this transistor. But this time, the carrier layer under the gold foil piece was connected to the negative terminal of the second battery. And the germanium under the carrier layer was connected to the positive terminal of the second battery, as you will see on the illustration that you just see right there on your screen. When the germanium and the carrier layer were connected to the second battery, no current flowed at all. Why did this happen? Well, I'm sure somebody in the comment section will clarify this. Okay? There is a tiny space between the 2 gold foil pieces. When these gold foil pieces were brought close together, protons started to flow from the first carrier layer to the second carrier layer. This caused current to flow from the positive terminal of the battery to the germanium. And this caused current to flow from the carrier layer under the second gold foil piece to the negative terminal of the battery, of the second battery. So now we know the basic configuration of a MOSFET transistor. But this is not the end of the discussion. A MOSFET transistor, a true MOSFET transistor, contains silicon. Okay, that's why they call it a metal oxide semiconductor. Silicon happens to be the 14th element of the periodic table. It has an atomic mass of 28.085. This is the material that's used in the MOSFET transistor. Obviously, silicon, like copper, can conduct electricity, but you have to regulate how much electricity that silicon conducts. If not, then the electrical current can damage or even destroy the MOSFET transistor. That's why the silicon is sandwiched between a conductor, which can be copper, and an all-metal insulator, which can be sulfur. But silicon doesn't conduct electricity as well as copper does. So impurities are injected into the silicon. One of these impurities is called phosphorus. Phosphorus is the 15th element in the periodic table, and it has an atomic mass of 30.97. Do you now see why you have to memorize the periodic table? Now, if you'll recall correctly, I made a video about a term called pentavalent. Okay? Phosphorus happens to be pentavalent. It's a pentavalent material. Okay? Now, if phosphorus is injected into the silicon, then the MOSFET becomes an N-type semiconductor. That's because the silicon and the phosphorus contain more electrons. And this silicon and phosphorus combination becomes the carrier layer for the first transistor. For this transistor, not first transistor, this transistor. But what would happen if you injected the silicon with the impurity known as boron? Well, boron is the 5th element of the periodic table and has an atomic mass of 10.811. Obviously, this silicon-boron combination would become the carrier layer of this transistor. But you have to keep in mind that this layer would be considered a trivalent layer. And I covered that term in the pentavalent layer video. Okay? So this transistor would be considered a P-type semiconductor. We also know that P-type semiconductors contain lots of protons but very few electrons. That means there are holes in this P-type semiconductor. So what happens if you bring an N-type semiconductor and a P-type semiconductor together? electrons from the N-type semiconductor immediately flow to the P-type semiconductor and fill the holes that are in the P-type semiconductor. There is a junction where the N-type semiconductor sends electrons to the P-type semiconductor. As the holes near the junction between the N-type semiconductor and the P-type semiconductor are filled, the charges near the junction are depleted. This area near the junction between the N-type semiconductor and the P-type semiconductor is called the depletion region. Of course, that also means lots of current flows from the P-type semiconductor to the N-type semiconductor. But what if we wanted to slow down this process? Well, let's grab us a battery. We will conduct the P-type semiconductor to... we're not going to conduct. We're going to connect. We're going to connect the P-type semiconductor to the positive terminal of the battery and the N-type semiconductor to the negative terminal of the battery. The battery will slow down the flow of electrons from the N-type semiconductor. This process of slowing down the flow of electrons and thus the flow of current is called the forward bias. Okay? This process also decreases the size of the depletion layer. But what would happen if we reverse the polarity of the battery? Well, then the depletion layer increases in size and we create a reverse bias. But what is polarity? To understand a polarity, you must understand that a battery has two poles. Okay? Now then, I wish I had a battery sitting right here. I'll show you that in an illustration. The first pole is the positive pole. The second pole is the negative pole. Now, one piece of the battery has more electrons than the other piece of the battery. This means that the piece of the battery that has more electrons can be referred to as the negative polarity. Okay, so you have a negative polarity component of the battery because it has more electrons than protons. If a component of a battery has more protons than electrons, then it can be referred to as the positive polarity component of the battery. A lot of fancy terms there, huh? There are two types of MOSFET transistors. The first one is called an enhancement type transistor, and then there is a depletion type transistor. What's the difference between an enhancement type and a depletion type transistor? Before I can fully discuss enhancement and depletion type transistors, I have to introduce another term to you. And this particular term will be covered in greater detail in a future video. It's called a floating gate. An enhancement type transistor is switched off when it doesn't receive voltage from the floating gate. A depletion type transistor, on the other hand, is switched on when it doesn't receive voltage from the floating gate. As you will recall, I covered the topic of voltage in a previous video. So what happens when a floating gate is filled with electrons or protons? Well, directly under the floating gate there is a trivalent boron and silicon mixed proton filled material. On the left and right sides of this trivalent boron positive filled material, there is a phosphorus and silicon mixed pentavalent electron filled material. Would you like for me to go over that one more time? I'm sure you do. Alright. Directly under the floating gate, there is a trivalent boron and silicon mixed proton filled material. Whew, that's a big mouthful. On the left and the right sides of this trivalent boron positive filled material, there is a phosphorus and silicon mixed pentavalent electron filled material. I'm sure you've heard all these terms at this point. The protons in the trivalent boron and the silicon mixed material are repelled by the protons that are being ejected into the floating gate. When this happens, electrons from the left pentavalent electron Let me say this again. When this happens, electrons from the left pentavalent electron-filled phosphorus and silicon mixed material start flowing to the right pentavalent electron-filled phosphorus and silicon mixed material. This creates what is known as an N-channel transistor. But what happens when you have an enhancement type P-channel transistor? I'll cover this topic as well as the term source and drain when I cover this topic the topic of floating gate. But for now, if you want to know more about this topic, watch this video right there, and I have a little hyperlink in the description box of this video. I really appreciate you guys watching this presentation, because I had a lot to say. Alright, I will tell you more in a future video, so I'd like for you to stay tuned.